Women pray that you never find this video because what you're about to hear isn't meant to please. It's meant to reveal. There is no comfortable romance here, no socially approved speeches. What you'll find instead is raw psychology, silent power, and truths that make people uncomfortable. Inspired by the ruthless logic of Machiavelli, this message dismantles dynamics no one wants you to question. This isn't an attack. It's a mirror, and once you look into it, you can no longer pretend you don't understand how the game really works. Women pray that you never find this video, not because it lies, but because it breaks the spell. Machiavelli never wrote about women directly, but he wrote about power, and whoever understands power understands every human dynamic where desire exists, where dependence appears, where fear of loss grows, and where control becomes necessary. What you're about to hear is not moral. It's not pretty. It's not romantic. It's real. And reality always offends those who feel comfortable living inside an illusion. From a young age, we're taught a sweetened story, that love is sacrifice, that being good guarantees reward, that giving without limits creates eternal gratitude. But Machiavelli already warned us, human beings are not driven by gratitude, they're driven by convenience. And when you apply this truth to attraction, what emerges feels uncomfortable, not because it's false, but because it works. Most men are raised to obey, to please, to wait. Women, on the other hand, learn very early to read emotions, to measure social power, to sense invisible hierarchies. That isn't cruelty, it's adaptation. Here's what no one says out loud. Attraction is not born from kindness. It's born from the perception of value, and value is never announced. It is demonstrated. When a man gives himself without conditions, when he makes a woman the center of his world, when he abandons his own axis, he doesn't create safety or deep love. He creates predictability, and what is predictable never awakens desire. Machiavelli would say it without hesitation. What is obtained without effort loses its value. What cannot be lost is never protected. Women pray that you never understand this, because the current system survives on men who don't. Men who believe more attention means more love. Men who think giving in is maturity, men who confuse patience with value. But in the real game of human psychology, the man who is always available loses symbolic weight. The man who sets no boundaries becomes conquered territory, and the man who fears loss has already lost. Watch patterns, not speeches. Watch who is respected, not who is said to be loved. Watch who is listened to when they speak little, not who explains everything. Constant validation kills mystery. Over-explaining weakens authority. Machiavelli understood that power lives in what is not fully revealed, in the ability to withdraw, in not needing, in not begging to be understood. Here comes the uncomfortable part. Many women don't want a man who makes them feel calm all the time. They want a man who makes them feel something. And the most powerful emotion is not constant tenderness, but the mix of attraction and controlled risk. Not real danger, but the sense that this man has options, direction, and a life that doesn't revolve around one person. That creates respect, and respect is the true precursor of lasting desire. The man who understands this stops chasing and starts choosing. He stops asking what she wants and starts observing how she responds to his absence, to his silence, to his firmness. Machiavelli would say that the one who controls his reactions controls the battlefield. And most relationships don't fail because of a lack of love, but because of an excess of fear. Fear of losing, fear of discomfort, fear of being replaced. Women pray that you never find this video because here the just be yourself narrative collapses when that self was built to please. Here it's revealed that attraction is not democratic. It doesn't reward intention, it rewards positioning. It doesn't respond to promises, but to consistent behavior. And the man who dissolves himself to be accepted ends up becoming invisible. This is not a call to cruelty, it's a call to clarity. Machiavelli never advised destruction, he advised understanding. And understanding human nature is the first step to stop being manipulated by it. When a man regains his center, his purpose, and his ability to walk away without drama, something changes. Not in women, but in him. And that change is exactly what this system does not want to happen. When Machiavelli spoke about fear and love, he made one thing very clear. Something few people are willing to accept. Human bonds are not sustained by ideals. They are sustained by perceptions. It doesn't matter who you are, what matters is what the other person believes you are. And that belief is built through actions, silences, boundaries, and above all, consistency. The fatal mistake of the modern man is believing that total transparency creates connection. In reality, it creates erosion. The human mind does not value what it fully understands. It values what it can sense but cannot control. Here comes an uncomfortable truth. Many emotional dynamics look more like a negotiation of power than a romantic story. Not because someone is evil, but because that's how human nature works when desire is involved. The one who needs less has the advantage. The one who can walk away controls the situation. And the one who stays out of fear becomes an emotional subject. Machiavelli would call this strategic weakness. Women pray that you never understand this because once you do, you stop reacting the way they expect. You stop chasing validation. You stop interpreting every gesture as a final signal. You stop trying to fix what isn't yours to fix. You begin to observe from the outside, like a player who sees the entire board. And when that happens, control is redistributed. Look at how many men lose themselves trying to be indispensable. They abandon their habits, their ambitions, their rhythm. They adapt so much that they disappear, and then they're surprised when interest fades. Machiavelli warned that excessive concessions do not buy loyalty. They buy silent contempt. Because the man who gives himself without resistance communicates without words, that he has no value worth protecting. Attraction does not respond to moral speeches. It responds to energy, to presence, to direction. A man without direction looks for refuge in a woman. A man with direction shares his path, but does not negotiate it. That difference is subtle, but devastating. The first asks permission to exist. The second invites, and if there is no response, he continues. That ability to keep moving forward is what creates respect. Here's the secret no one wants you to know. It's not that women want to manipulate, it's that they instinctively respond to stable emotional strength. To the man who doesn't break under uncertainty. To the man who doesn't dramatize distance. To the man who doesn't need control in order to feel secure. Machiavellian thinking understood that inner stability is the most dangerous form of power because it doesn't depend on external factors. When a man stops explaining his intentions and starts demonstrating his boundaries, the dynamic shifts. He's no longer predictable, no longer automatic, no longer easily replaceable. Not because he plays cheap games, but because he has his own world. And desire always gravitates toward what has an independent life. Women pray that you never realize that many emotional tests aren't conscious, but they exist. Drama, silence, ambiguity. They don't always seek to hurt you, they seek to measure your reaction. Do you fall apart? Do you chase? Do you justify yourself? Or do you hold your center? Machiavellian thinking would say, whoever reveals themselves under pressure reveals their true position in the hierarchy. The man who understands this stops taking everything personally. He understands that not everything needs a response, that not every distance is a problem, that not every doubt must be solved with words. Sometimes the most powerful response is calm, continuity, selective indifference, not as punishment, but as the natural result of having priorities. And this is where the system starts to shake. Because a man who doesn't panic is hard to control. He doesn't buy empty promises, he doesn't trade his dignity for intermittent attention. He doesn't settle for emotional crumbs. Machiavellian thinking warned that power is lost the moment you beg, and emotional begging is the most invisible form of modern slavery. This knowledge doesn't make you cold, it makes you aware. It removes you from the role of a supporting character in your own life. It gives you back the ability to choose, to walk away, to say no without guilt. And when you do that, something recalibrates, not because women change, but because your position changes. That's why they pray you never reach this point. Because here, the man stops being predictable. And unpredictability, when grounded and stable, always disrupts the balance. The biggest mistake is believing this knowledge exists to do something to a woman. It exists to stop making yourself small. Machiavellian thinking never taught how to control others from lack. It taught how to govern yourself first. The man who cannot govern himself tries to dominate externally what he cannot hold internally. And that is felt, sensed, rejected. True attraction is born when the other person senses that you are not a need, but a conscious choice. Women pray that you never understand that excessive attachment is a confession of insecurity, that constant messaging is not interest, it's anxiety, that endless explaining is not clarity, It's fear. And fear, in any power dynamic, weakens. Machiavellian thinking understood this well. Whoever shows fear too early hands over the advantage. In relationships, the same thing happens. It's just never called strategy. It's called feelings. Watch how dynamics shift when a man doesn't chase stimulation, when he doesn't respond immediately, when he doesn't apologize for existing. That doesn't guarantee anything, but it reveals something essential. The dynamic changes because you are no longer an unlimited emotional resource. You become someone who decides when, how, and with whom he invests his energy. And energy is the real currency of desire. Here's another uncomfortable truth. Most conflicts don't arise from what you do. They arise from what you allow. You allow small acts of disrespect. You allow draining ambiguity. You allow games that don't benefit you. And then you wonder why the bond becomes unbalanced. Machiavellian thinking would say disorder begins when authority is not exercised early, not with violence, but with clear boundaries. The man who understands this doesn't threaten, doesn't complain, doesn't beg. He simply acts accordingly. If something doesn't serve him, he withdraws. If something isn't clear, he doesn't insist. If something disrupts him, he prioritizes his internal structure. That ability to walk away without resentment is seen as coldness by those who need control, but as strength by those who seek real stability. Women pray that you never realize that many times "I don't know what I want" really means "I want to see how much you'll lose yourself for me." Not always consciously, but effectively. And when a man loses himself, he becomes less attractive. Because attraction doesn't feed on one-sided sacrifice. It feeds on balanced exchange. Machiavellian thinking warned that forced loyalty is weak. Chosen loyalty is powerful. When you stop chasing, you don't guarantee someone will stay. You guarantee something far more important. That whoever stays does so out of conviction, not pressure. And that changes the quality of the bond. You're no longer negotiating for attention, you're sharing presence. You're no longer buying affection with effort, you're offering companionship from a place of abundance. The system fears men like this because they are hard to label. They don't fit the role of the good guy or the bad guy. They don't react as expected. They don't live dependent on external judgment. And that alone disarms many games. Machiavellian thinking taught that true power does not need to be constantly displayed. It reveals itself in the consistency between what is said and what is done. Here, another illusion collapses: the belief that emotional intensity equals deep connection. Many times, intensity is just dependence in disguise. Calm, on the other hand, is often mistaken for boredom by those who thrive on drama. But sustained calm is the foundation of any lasting bond, and not everyone is prepared for it. That's why when a man becomes stable without becoming submissive, selective without becoming cruel, firm without becoming rigid, his environment grows uncomfortable. Women pray that you never understand that you don't have to win every emotional battle. You have to choose which ones are worth your energy, that not every attraction deserves investment, that not every initial interest deserves continuation, and that saying no at the right time is a form of self-respect that filters toxic dynamics before they take root. This knowledge doesn't promise guaranteed happy endings. It promises something more valuable: dignity, autonomy, clarity. It removes you from the role of an emotional beggar and returns you to the role of protagonist in your own life. Machiavellian thinking never promised that the path of power would be comfortable. It promised it would be real. That's why this message is uncomfortable. Because it doesn't offer comfort, it offers responsibility. And responsibility is the last thing people want to assume when they've built their identity around the reactions of others. If you've made it this far, you can no longer pretend you don't know. And once knowledge is acquired, the game changes forever. When a man awakens to this logic, he begins to see patterns where he once saw only emotional confusion. He understands that many relationships don't fail suddenly. They erode slowly due to a lack of structure. Machiavellian thinking spoke of states that fall not because of a great attack, but because of small accumulated concessions. The same thing happens in intimacy. Every time you betray a boundary to avoid discomfort, every time you silence something essential out of fear of loss, every time you accept less than you know you deserve, you weaken your position without even realizing it. Women pray that you never understand that excessive, misdirected empathy makes you manipulable. Not because empathy is wrong, but because when it isn't paired with firmness, it becomes an open door. The man who absorbs everything, justifies everything, understands everything, ends up carrying what was never his to carry. And when he finally breaks, it's already too late. Machiavellian thinking warned that unlimited indulgence does not create gratitude. It creates growing expectations. Here is a silent rule that governs attraction. No one values what they feel they can emotionally control. Control kills desire. Not authoritarian control, but the control that comes from predictability. Knowing you'll always be there, that you'll always respond, that you'll always give in. That turns presence into background noise, into something constant, expected, invisible. And desire needs contrast. It needs space. It needs the possibility of loss, even if it's never spoken. The man who internalizes this stops seeking external approval as proof of his worth. He no longer needs to be chosen to feel valid. He chooses first. He chooses where he invests his time, his attention, his energy. And that selection is never announced. It's practiced. Machiavellian thinking understood that the most stable form of power doesn't need to be declared. It's perceived in the calm of a man who knows he can walk away and still remain whole. Women pray that you never realize that rejection is often not personal. It's hierarchical. They don't reject the person, they reject the position he occupies. When a man presents himself from lack, from urgency, from the need to be accepted, he occupies a weak position. And attraction cannot grow from there. It doesn't matter how kind you are, how attentive, how understanding. If your center is outside yourself, the bond begins distorted. This is where many men get confused and fall into extremes. They think the solution is to become cold, distant, calculating. No, that's just another reaction, another form of dependence. Machiavellian thinking was never about pretending. It was about understanding, about acting from reality, not fantasy. A strong man doesn't disappear to create impact. He simply doesn't stay where he isn't valued. He doesn't punish. He doesn't manipulate. He doesn't dramatize. He moves. And movement is power. Notice how the dynamic changes when you stop justifying yourself, when you stop giving explanations you once offered out of fear, when you accept that not every misunderstanding needs to be resolved. Sometimes excessive clarity is just another way of asking for permission. Machiavellian thinking would say, the one who explains too much reveals insecurity in his position. In relationships, that translates into a loss of attraction. Women pray that you never understand that attraction cannot be negotiated, cannot be convinced, cannot be won with arguments. It either awakens or it doesn't, and when it doesn't, insisting only lowers your perceived value. The conscious man knows when to withdraw. He knows how to read signals without obsessing. He knows that dignity is not negotiable, even when desire is present. Here's another uncomfortable truth. Many relationships are sustained not by love, but by fear of being alone. That fear disguises itself as commitment, as patience, as fighting for us. Machiavellian thinking warned that agreements built on fear are unstable. They eventually break. Only bonds chosen freely, without pressure, carry real strength. When a man stops fearing loss, he becomes magnetic. Not because he's indifferent, but because he's free. And freedom is deeply attractive. Not the freedom of chaos, but the freedom of a man with internal structure. The man who doesn't need to possess in order to feel secure. The man who doesn't need to monitor to trust himself. The man who doesn't cling because he knows his life doesn't depend on a single variable. Women pray that you never awaken to this truth, because once you do, the game changes. You're no longer a predictable piece. You no longer react the way they expect. You no longer move from guilt or from urgency. You become someone who observes, chooses, and acts with coherence. And that dismantles many dynamics that only survive while a man doesn't understand his own power. This is not a comfortable path. It means losing relationships that were sustained by imbalance. It means disappointing other people's expectations. It means enduring moments of solitude without rushing to fill them with cheap validation. Machiavellian thinking would say that every process of strengthening faces initial resistance, but the result is stability. And stability, even when it isn't loud, is deeply feared by those who live off emotional chaos. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't about dominating anyone. It's about not being dominated by your own reactions, about not trading your center for intermittent attention, about not confusing intensity with depth. This understanding doesn't make you invincible, it makes you responsible. And responsibility is the true beginning of power. That's why this message isn't popular. It doesn't promise magic formulas or guaranteed results. It promises clarity. And clarity, once it arrives, cannot be unseen. When you reach this point, you begin to notice something unsettling. Many truths aren't hidden because they're complex, but because they're simple and dangerous. Dangerous to a system that functions best when a man doubts himself. Machiavellian thinking understood that a confused population is easier to govern than a violent one. The same applies to relationships. A confused, guilty, reactive man is easier to lead than one who is clear, firm, and grounded in his direction. Women pray that you never understand that guilt is a far more effective tool of emotional control than force. Guilt makes you explain yourself. It makes you apologize for legitimate needs. It makes you silence truths out of fear of appearing harsh. And when a man starts operating from guilt, he no longer negotiates as an equal. He negotiates from debt. Machiavellian thinking would say that the man who accepts a permanent moral debt voluntarily places himself in an inferior position. Here's something almost no one dares to say. Not every connection is meant to grow, and forcing it is a form of silent violence against yourself. The man who insists where there is no reciprocity isn't demonstrating love, he's demonstrating attachment. And attachment, when it isn't mutual, leads to erosion, resentment, and loss of respect. Attraction does not survive prolonged self-betrayal. Notice how your perception changes when you stop interpreting every gesture as a test of your worth, when you understand that interest fluctuates, that desire isn't constant, that idealization is fragile. Machiavellian thinking taught that the one who governs well is not surprised by human inconsistency, he anticipates it. In emotional territory, anticipation isn't distrust, it's the ability to keep your center when the other person changes. Women pray that you never realize that many dynamics survive only while you are the one adapting, the one waiting, the one understanding, the one giving in. But when you stop doing that, not because you become hostile, but because you become selective, the bond either redefines itself or breaks, and both outcomes are revealing. Machiavellian thinking would say that real agreements are tested when one side stops giving for free. Many men confuse love with unlimited tolerance. They believe loving means enduring. But endurance without reciprocity is not love. It's fear of loss. And fear, once it settles in, leaks into every word, every gesture, every silence. The other person senses it, even if they never name it. And what is perceived as fear rarely awakens desire. When a man stops asking permission to be who he is, something profound happens. He doesn't become arrogant, he becomes integrated. He doesn't seek to impose, he seeks coherence. He doesn't need to win arguments, he needs to preserve his structure. Machiavellian thinking understood that internal stability is more threatening than external aggression because it offers no easy points of attack. Women pray that you never understand that many conflicts don't arise because you ask for too much, but because you ask from a weak position. Asking from need creates resistance. Asking from abundance creates choice. The difference isn't in the request, it's in the position behind it, and that position is built outside the relationship, in your life, your purpose, your ability to sustain yourself without depending emotionally on a single source. Here another myth collapses, that love can handle everything. No, love cannot survive a lack of boundaries. It cannot survive constant self-negation. It cannot survive the absence of self-respect. Machiavellian thinking would say no kingdom survives when the ruler betrays his own laws. The same is true in intimacy. When you betray your values to avoid losing someone, you lose something far more serious, your internal authority. Women pray that you never awaken to the idea that you don't need to close every story, that not every connection requires a final explanation, that sometimes silence is not cowardice, it's closure. The man who needs the last word often needs the last validation as well. The man who doesn't need her keeps moving forward. And moving forward without resentment, without drama, is a clear sign of emotional power. This understanding forces you to accept something uncomfortable. You are not a passive victim of every dynamic you've lived. You participated. You allowed things. You postponed boundaries. And recognizing that is not about blaming yourself, it's about taking control back. Machiavellian thinking taught that freedom begins the moment you accept your share of responsibility in the disorder around you. When you integrate this, you stop asking how to make someone stay. You start asking who deserves to stay. You stop wondering what to say to please and start focusing on what to do to remain coherent with yourself. And that shift changes everything. Because desire born from self-respect doesn't depend on tricks. It depends on consistency. Women pray that you never reach this point because this is where the cycle breaks. The cycle of the man who chases, explains, adapts, and loses himself. Here, another path begins. The path of the man who observes, decides, and moves without guilt. Not because he doesn't feel, but because he doesn't betray himself. If you continue, you'll never look at your relationships the same way again. And that is the true point of no return. When a man reaches this level of understanding, he begins to notice something even more uncomfortable. Many of the social rules he was taught about love were not designed for his well-being, but for his docility, to make him adapt, to make him give in, to make him apologize for wanting more. Machiavellian thinking understood that the most stable systems are not the most just ones, but the ones that convince those who lose that it's for their own good. Something similar happens in modern relationships. Women pray that you never realize that constant sacrifice is not a virtue when it isn't reciprocal. Giving more doesn't always elevate a bond. Sometimes it destabilizes it. And imbalance, even when it first feels like love, eventually turns into resentment. The man who always gives, always waits, and waits too long doesn't break suddenly. He breaks silently. Machiavellian thinking warned that patience without strategy is a slow form of defeat. Here's a truth many people reject. Not all emotional pain is a sign of depth. Sometimes it's simply a sign of poor choice. But accepting that means letting go of the romantic narrative. And that hurts more than believing love was just difficult. Machiavellian thinking taught that misplaced pride keeps men tied to lost causes. In emotional life, that pride is called hope. Women pray that you never understand that poorly managed hope is a chain. It keeps you waiting for signals, interpreting gestures, justifying absences. It keeps you invested in something that isn't growing, and the more you invest, the harder it becomes to walk away. Machiavellian thinking understood this well. Attachment to a failed investment is what destroys kingdoms and men. When a man learns to walk away in time, he doesn't become cynical. He becomes selective. He learns to tell the difference between real interest and intermittent attention, between reciprocity and tolerance, between desire and habit. And that ability isn't learned by reading external signals. It's learned by listening to the internal discomfort you used to ignore. That discomfort was information, not weakness. This is where the romantic narrative collapses, because no one told you that sometimes loving means leaving, sometimes caring means letting go, and sometimes the strongest act is not insisting, but withdrawing with dignity. Machiavellian thinking would say that knowing when to abandon a position is just as important as knowing how to defend it. In relationships, staying without self-respect is losing the war, even if you remain present. Women pray that you never discover that many bonds survive only as long as you're willing to tolerate more than you should. When you stop doing that, not because you harden, but because you realign with yourself, the bond either transforms or dissolves, and in both cases, the truth surfaces. Machiavellian thinking taught that the truth of power is revealed when unearned privileges are withdrawn. Some men confuse intensity with love because they never learn to be calm without feeling empty. Drama gives them identity. Turbulence gives them purpose. But that kind of connection exhausts. It doesn't build. It doesn't last. The man who understands this stops chasing emotional fireworks and begins to value stability that doesn't demand constant sacrifice. And that changes his choices. Women pray that you never realize that you don't need to convince anyone of your value, because anyone who needs convincing is no longer in a position to choose you freely. Authentic desire isn't persuaded, it's recognized, and when it isn't there, insisting doesn't create it, it wears it down. Machiavellian thinking warned that authority, which needs to explain itself, has already lost part of its strength. Here, another spell breaks. The belief that time invested guarantees results. It doesn't. Time only amplifies what already exists. If there is reciprocity, it strengthens it. If there is imbalance, it worsens it. The man who keeps investing, hoping time will fix what was never solid, only deepens his own loss, and later calls love what was really fear of starting over. Women pray that you never awaken to the idea that being alone is not failure. Failure is staying where you dissolve. Failure is negotiating your voice to avoid discomfort. Failure is confusing attachment with commitment. The man who accepts solitude as a legitimate stage stops tolerating bonds that make him smaller. And that selective tolerance is a form of silent power. When you integrate all of this, you stop searching for external strategies. You stop asking what to say, when to write, how to act to provoke something. You become simple, clear, direct. And that simplicity dismantles games, because there is nothing harder to manipulate than someone who doesn't need to prove anything. Machiavellian thinking understood this. The truly strong man doesn't react. Act. Women pray that you never reach this point, because this is where a man stops being an emotionally exploitable resource. This is where he stops begging for affection, where he stops living off ambiguous signals, where he starts choosing from calm, not from urgency. And that transformation doesn't benefit everyone. It only benefits the man who lives it. This knowledge doesn't promise eternal love, it promises something rarer, inner peace. And inner peace is dangerous to any dynamic that feeds on emotional chaos. That's why this message is uncomfortable. It doesn't seek to please, it seeks to wake you up. And once a man wakes up, he no longer fits into simple narratives. There comes a point where a man who has understood all of this no longer identifies with most of the stories he hears. He no longer sees himself as the man who gave everything and was betrayed, nor as the man who loves more than he receives. He begins to notice that many of those stories share one thing in common: the systematic abandonment of one's own center. Machiavellian thinking taught that no ruler loses power overnight. He gives it away slowly, believing it will prevent greater conflict. Emotionally, the same thing happens. Women pray that you never understand that much of modern male suffering doesn't come from rejection, but from prolonged self-negation, from saying yes when you wanted to say no, from staying when your intuition asked for distance, from confusing understanding with unlimited tolerance. That kind of pain doesn't create growth, it creates erosion, and constant erosion makes you more dependent, not stronger. Here's a truth that even advanced men resist. Many times, you didn't lose someone, you lost yourself trying to keep them, and that is far more serious. Machiavellian thinking would say that losing an external position can be repaired. Losing internal authority is the beginning of chaos. When a man lets his identity revolve around external approval, he becomes vulnerable to every mood shift, every silence, every threat of abandonment. Women pray that you never realize that lasting attraction isn't built by promising security, but by embodying it. Not by saying, "You can trust me," but by showing that your life doesn't collapse when someone doubts. That stability isn't negotiated, it's felt. And it's felt when you don't chase, when you don't pressure, when you don't try to close what isn't open. Machiavellian thinking understood that strategic patience is more powerful than impulsive action. Many men believe that setting boundaries will make them be abandoned. The truth is harsher. Not setting them guarantees you will lose yourself. A boundary is not a threat. It's a clear border, and borders create respect, even when they create distance. The man who fears setting boundaries often ends up resentful, and resentment destroys any chance of genuine desire. Women pray that you never understand that not every distance is a test you must pass. Sometimes it's an answer. Sometimes it's a message you keep reinterpreting because accepting it would force an uncomfortable decision. Machiavellian thinking warned that men often deceive themselves before accepting a reality that demands action. In relationships, that self-deception is called persistent hope. When a man stops living, waiting for what might happen, he recovers a freedom many never experience. He no longer invests energy in imaginary scenarios. He no longer anticipates problems that don't exist. He no longer acts from anxiety, he acts from observation. And observing without reacting immediately is a higher form of power. It's not coldness, it's inner mastery. Women pray that you never awaken to the idea that you don't need to be chosen by everyone, understood by everyone, or desired by everyone. You only need coherence with yourself. The man who tries to please everyone eventually dissolves. The man who chooses himself naturally filters his environment and science. And that filter, even if it reduces options, raises the quality of the connections that remain. Here, another dangerous myth breaks, that true love requires constant sacrifice. No, true love requires alignment. It requires two people moving forward together without one shrinking so the other can feel comfortable. Machiavellian thinking would say no agreement is stable when one side gives up its strength to sustain it. Women pray that you never understand that calm is not boredom, it's maturity. That the absence of drama is not a lack of passion, it's the presence of stability. Not everyone is prepared for that. Some confuse intensity with life because they don't know how to inhabit silence without feeling empty. The man who learns to remain calm without losing presence becomes rare. And what is rare always disrupts the balance. When you integrate all of this, your decisions change without speeches or explanations. You leave earlier. You stay only where there is reciprocity. You don't chase explanations. You don't force closure. You don't trade your dignity for emotional crumbs, and that way of moving through life creates an inevitable reaction. Some people move closer, others move away. Both outcomes are valuable information. Women pray that you never reach this point because here the man stops being reactive. He stops living according to external stimulus. He stops chasing constant validation. He becomes emotionally autonomous. And emotional autonomy is dangerous to any dynamic built on dependence, guilt, or confusion. This point marks a silent difference. You no longer need to convince anyone of anything. You don't explain your value. You don't justify your decisions. You don't defend yourself from other people's interpretations. You simply act from your center. Machiavellian thinking taught that the most solid power is the one that doesn't need constant defense. In intimacy, the same applies. If you've made it this far, you can no longer pretend ignorance. You now see that many battles you fought were unnecessary, that many losses were warnings, that many periods of waiting were choices disguised as destiny. And this recognition, as uncomfortable as it may be, returns something essential to you: control over your own life. That's why this message isn't easily shared. It doesn't promise perfect endings, it promises clarity, and clarity demands sacrifice. Letting go of fantasy, letting go of self-deception, letting go of the need for approval. But in return, it offers something few people possess: internal coherence. When you reach the end of this journey, something irreversible happens. You can no longer hear the same narratives without noticing the cracks. You can no longer accept ready-made explanations without asking yourself who they truly serve. Machiavellian thinking understood that real knowledge doesn't calm you, it disturbs you. Because once you see the mechanism, you can no longer pretend it works by magic. And that, while liberating, also carries a cost. Women pray that you never reach this point, because here, the man stops asking permission to be who he is. Here he stops wondering if he's exaggerating, if he's asking for too much, if he should settle. Here he understands that his discomfort wasn't a personal flaw, it was a signal he ignored. Machiavellian thinking taught that the symptoms of a sick state appear long before its collapse, but only the attentive recognize them. The same happens in intimacy. Here you realize that many dynamics only existed because you sustained them, because you over-explained, because you gave too much, because you waited too long without demanding reciprocity. And when you withdraw that, not as punishment but as an act of coherence, the bond reveals itself as it truly is. Some relationships strengthen, many break, but everything becomes visible. and seeing without illusion is power. Women pray that you never understand that you don't need to close with words what is already clear through actions, that not every story deserves an epic ending, that sometimes leaving in silence is the cleanest form of self-respect. Machiavellian thinking would say that a wise ruler doesn't announce every move, he acts when necessary. In relationships, timely silence says more than 1,000 explanations. Here, the final trap collapses. The belief that this understanding will make you insensitive. It won't. It makes you selective. It gives you back the ability to feel without losing yourself, to engage without dissolving, to love without kneeling. The man who integrates this doesn't run from connection, he runs from self-betrayal. And that difference changes everything. Women pray that you never realize that you don't have to prove your worth. Anyone who demands constant proof is no longer in a position to choose you freely. Real value isn't negotiated, it's recognized. And when it isn't recognized, insisting doesn't create it, it devalues it. Machiavellian thinking warned that authority, dependent on constant approval, is no longer authority, it's organized pleading. At this point, many questions disappear on their own. You no longer ask, "What did I do wrong?" You ask, "Does this serve me?" You no longer ask, "How do I recover this?" You ask, "Why would I want to?" You stop obsessing over ambiguous signals because prolonged ambiguity is an answer in itself. The man who understands this stops interpreting and starts deciding. Women pray that you never awaken to the idea that love is not begged for, not chased, not negotiated from below. Healthy love happens between two people who choose each other without abandoning themselves. Everything else is attachment, habit, or fear disguised as romance. And fear, no matter how intense, builds nothing lasting. Here you accept something final. Not everyone will walk with you in this version of yourself. Some will leave because they no longer receive the same benefits. Others, because the mirror you represent makes them uncomfortable. And a few will stay, because now the relationship is built on choice, not need. Machiavellian thinking would say that losing false allies is the inevitable price of gaining real stability. This is the point where a man stops being a reaction and becomes a cause. He no longer lives waiting for the next message, the next signal, the next validation. He lives in motion, in coherence, in direction. And that direction doesn't guarantee the absence of pain, but it guarantees something far more valuable: meaning. Because pain with meaning can be endured. Pain without meaning destroys you. Women pray that you never find this video because this is where the spell breaks completely. Here, a man is no longer easily blamed, no longer easily manipulated, no longer easily confused. Here, he understands that his attention is valuable, that his time is limited, that his energy is not infinite, and he begins to manage it that way. Machiavellian thinking taught that ruling is, above all, the management of resources. In your life, the resource is you. In the end, this isn't about winning over anyone, it's about not losing yourself. About not giving away your center for emotional crumbs. About not calling love what was actually fear. About not calling destiny what was really avoided choice. This understanding doesn't make you superior, it makes you responsible. And responsibility, even when it feels heavy, is the true beginning of freedom. If you've made it this far, there is no going back. You know now, and knowledge, even when it's uncomfortable, is always better than living asleep. That's why they pray. Because a man who awakens no longer fits, and a man who no longer fits is no longer controllable. This is the end of the message, and for many, the true beginning.